really appreciate Colin giving us his time tonight to talk to us about wild gardening. My name is, this is the spike bit, the advertising bit. My name is Peter Nolan, and I'm the Green Party candidate for next year's council for Westport. I don't know why I fluffed that, so I'll get better at it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand over, just say hi to you all, thank you for coming, and I'm going to hand over to Fergus, who's going to introduce Colin for you. Thank you.
Thank you for a small man. Okay, well, the first thing I have to say is I'm a Green Party member for a long time, so we will take any good donations we can, and that lovely little bowl down the end, because we need every little cash we can. But much more importantly, I really want to thank Tom, because he's been living here in town, he's doing us a major favour to come down, because we really want to try and promote biodiversity and the environment, and I'm sure he woke up this morning and he needs this like a hole in the head. But in fairness to him, it was my glorious dinner that I got today. Look, I don't need to introduce Colin, everybody knows who he is. They say he's taken over from David, I agree with everything he says. He's a fantastic guy, I can't thank him enough for coming down, so that's it. I'm going to hand over to him and let him get on with the show. Okay, no worries. Hello everyone, and thanks so much for coming along. It's nice to see so many people, particularly on a fine evening. If you're ever in the business of giving talks or giving TV programs, you want rotten weather, because it tends to attract much bigger crowds. But anyway, so it's great to drag yourself along here this evening. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to everyone for having me along. Very, very pleased to be asked, and very pleased to be here all together. A few days ago, my daughter said that she's been working in Greece over the summer, working in the bar, working on diapers. And she was chatting to some friends of hers about me, and they said, you know, what does your mum do, what does your dad do? I said, oh, my dad's good. I'm like, oh yeah, what's he do? Anyway, they decided to Google me, and I was delighted with the results. Apparently, I live in a mansion in Dublin. I'm worth at least 8 million euros, and I'm 5'11". So, all wonderful news, all wonderful news. Anyway, yeah, the things you read on that. So, biodiversity, here tonight to talk about biodiversity. And I guess ever since I've been a child, it's something that has interested me. I think I was very lucky growing up that my parents allowed me that kind of childhood to wander and roam wherever I wanted. It was incredibly important. I was talking to my mother lately, who's very elderly, and we were just looking back and saying, you know, when I was 13 years of age, I used to take the bus down to Westport. I would walk 5 miles to the beach and go camping there for a week by myself, and go rock fishing at night and cook up my fish and all that sort of stuff. Now, if you said, where's, you know, Johnny today? I'd say, he's just gone down to Wexford camping on his own for a week. He'd probably have the police around. But anyway, so I was very grateful to have been allowed all that sort of, all that time to just explore the world. Very little was arranged for those days, and so nature was what I had all around me. I was brought up in South County Dublin, and I was able to see that change that was to happen around where I lived. We were surrounded by farmland. I saw with my own eyes the marsh where I used to go as a child. I saw it disappear under houses. The big road that came out of Dublin went right through our property. And now I can go back to that place and I just don't recognise it anymore. There's one tree I recognise in the entire area that I used to climb as a kid. And that's the only thing that's left. So ever since I was young, I've seen how the world has been changing. And then as soon as I could get out of school, I couldn't get out of school quick enough. Not that there was anything bad about the school. The people who went to school were wonderful people. And I'm sure if I listened to the teachers, they were probably reasonable people too. But I just didn't like the whole sort of, I suppose, the inflexibility of it. I didn't like timetables. And I left school thinking the one thing I did want to do was have a life that was not timetabled in any way. And I'm glad to say, I left school when I was 18. I'm Big birthday coming up next year. So just over 40 years since I left school, I guess. And I've never had a weekend since I left school. I've never had a job that's had a weekend. So I can look back vaguely to that feeling, that sense of an end of the week coming, but it's something that I have avoided ever since, and all the ups and downs that entails. Anyway, I spent, I guess, a career as a wildlife filmmaker. Going around the world, I've seen a huge amount of change happening in the world. And I came back to Ireland just before COVID. I've been based in Ireland for years, but I came back from a trip overseas, and COVID came, and we wondered what we were going to do next. And I happened to go to a wildlife filmmaking conference in Bristol, and I happened to bump into the commissioner of the BBC who was there. And normally to get anything commissioned these days you have to go through piles of people, but I was with the man himself having a cup of coffee, and I talked to him about this idea of doing a series on wild gardening. He said, well, what do you mean by wild gardening? And I said, well, gardening with native plants alone. And he said, why would you want to do that? And I said, well, I want to create a nature reserve, and every nature reserve in the world is made of native plants. That relationship between native insects and native plants, which is the fundamental basis, I guess, of all the ecologies. And so I'm just going to give you a little flavour of what that programme was all about, just to get the ball rolling, and hopefully the sound and everything will be about right.
I've always loved wild places. Places where nature's in charge. But I grew up in a very different world. A world of pristine lawns and perfect roses. Gardening was my family's life. My dad was a TV gardener. But my playgrounds were always the woods and the wild. My name is Colin Stafford Johnston. I'm a wildlife cameraman, and I've spent most of my life filming some of the most amazing creatures and places on planet Earth. But now I'm coming home. On the east coast of Ireland, I want to turn my old childhood garden into a haven for wildlife. Now I'm no gardener, but over the next couple of years I want to transform this long abandoned acre completely. My plan is to go native, to only use plants that naturally occur on this island. I'm going to dig ponds, sow wildflower meadows, plant hedgerows and native woodlands, all in the hope of attracting as many creatures as possible to come and live here with me. I'm going to create my very own wild garden.
So, yeah, my dad was a TV gardener back in the 1970s. Some of you might remember him. His name was Barney Johnson. And I grew up in the garden centre, surrounded by nurseries, surrounded by plants. And I remember gardening in those days. I remember walking around. I remember the weight of the roundup. Because not only as a kid was I allowed to go off rock fishing at night by myself, but I was also allowed to use roundup and chainsaws and everything else. And so I guess, but that was gardening in those days. It came from, that was a time when the world was very different to the way it is now. Anyway, after I left school, I'd always wanted to travel. I spent the next 7 years of my life traveling around the world. And that was to really be life-changing. And on that journey, I saw so many of the great ecosystems of the world were changing. And of course, the greatest changes really in the world have happened since about the time I left school in 1982. There's an old article I have from a Time magazine in 1982 that described the Amazon as being untouched. Well, I've been there quite a few times since, and let me tell you, it's been touched. Vast areas have disappeared completely. But I always wanted into the field of nature in some way. I didn't quite know what I was going to do, and I was once passing through. I used to, with my overseas trips, I always used to go through London to fly places. And I used to get my teeth checked when I was, because you used to get your teeth done for free in London in those days. And I picked up a university guide. It was a guide to all the universities in England. and was a degree in biology and filmmaking. That was being carried out in close cooperation with the BBC Natural History Unit in Bristol, where most natural history films in the world go through Bristol at some stage in their lives. So I thought this might be something I might be interested in doing, and I applied and I became a wildlife cameraman as soon as I left. I spent the next few years filming around the world, and I suppose for anyone's sort of career in those days, and to a certain extent now, you always want to end up working with David Attenborough one day. And so I remember I got the call one day, would you like to do this film on barbering macaques with David Attenborough? And I said, thank you very much, I'll do that.
It's not always plain sailing, even for the older youngsters. This one has spent hours collecting grains of barley and storing most of them in his tea pouches to eat later on in the day. Unfortunately, he hasn't bargained on his greedy mother's reaction. She hasn't any second thoughts about stealing food from her own stuff. Selfishly, she's intent on pinching every grain. There's clearly no honour among thieves.
And himself, but I guess the creature I concentrated most on were tigers. I remember I was sitting one wet day in Bristol. I'd been living in the tent outside Bristol for a year because I had absolutely no money. I was trying to get the money together to buy a camera. And so I was renting a field in South Wales for £30 a week, but it was an ensuite field, a field with a bathroom. And so it was a way of trying to save, I think it was 30 quid a week. Anyway, it was a way of getting some money and trying to save my money, because the phone rang one day. I remember it was one of those days when you think, oh, like Monday afternoon, nothing much had happened that day, trying to get into the business. And there was a voice at the end of the phone said, is that Colin Stafford Johnston? I said, it is. He said, oh, well, my name's Mike Burkhead, who is one of the biggest producers of natural history films in the world. And he said, I'm making a tiger film in India, and would you be interested? And I said, yeah, and what would you like me to do? Like, whose bags would you like me to carry? And he said, well, I was rather hoping you'd film it. And it was in the days of the BBC when it was very much sort of, well, there you go, you get 225 days to make this film. Get yourself to India, find a tiger, and bring us back a story. And that doesn't happen anymore. But it was a wonderful time. And so I set off to India. And I spent the next sort of regularly, the next 4 or 5 years of my life, at least half the year spent with tigers, 200 days a year, following one particular tiger family. It was in a place called Ranthambore in Rajasthan. And it was a really unique opportunity. No one had ever spent as much time with a tiger family as myself and my mate Salim and Ajitya had. There were 3 of us who were going around day after day filming, forming a very close bond between ourselves, because when you're working that closely with people and it's 45 degrees centigrade, you've got to make sure that you get on with people. But anyway, I was told that my job was to find a tiger that was at an interesting stage in its life. Well, of course, I had no idea about tigers, let alone what an interesting stage in tiger's life was. But once I arrived around the board, my luck was in. It was one of those things, you know, sometimes you look back in life and there's little things that make a huge difference to your life. And at the time, they don't seem that important. But when I came into Ranthambore, my first tiger I saw around these beautiful lakes. There's the best, the most photogenic tiger habitat in the world is in this place called Ranthambore. There's a fort on the hill, there's these lakes in the foreground. It's a place where people used to live, so this wonderful sort of mix between these old ruins and now these tigers. And I came across a tiger family, and there was a female who had 3 large female cubs that were about 18 months old, just at the stage that they were setting off in their independence. So I thought, now here are 3 tigers at an interesting stage in their life. So which one of them am I going to follow? And there was something about one tiger. She was a little bit more recognizable. There was something a little bit about her. And I thought, I think we're going to follow that one. And little did I know, at that moment, she was going to become the most famous tiger in the world. She earned about $25 million for the local economy. and she made a fundamental difference to my life and to many others. And this is a little scene that we filmed, many years ago now, but for me it was one of the most poignant scenes. I was never all that interested in filming things killing things particularly, which someone said when you're making a film about big cats it's a disadvantage. But anyway, I never particularly liked watching things being killed. I'm very happy to watch them do everything else, and the relationships that tigers have with other tigers, with their sons and daughters and relatives, I found really interesting. Anyway, this was a scene whereby I'd been filming for about 3 years. Actually had 2 big cubs and 2 big male cubs. They were about 20 months old, 21 months old, an age which they should have long really left their mother, but they're a bit like Irish sons, they're a bit slow to ship. And this was just a beautiful scene. We came in one day and we could tell that she had gone hunting. By looking at the tracks on the road, we could tell that the cubs were in the bushes and she had gone hunting. So we sat up there because we knew she'd have to come back for them. The idea is she'd leave them, they'd interfere with the hunting strategy, she'd go off and kill something and come back and call them. But we weren't quite expecting what was going to happen next.
I remember the last time that the family were together. Magically left the cubs and she'd gone hunting. A couple of hours later she came back and she started roaring. She was calling the cubs. Then we heard a rustle in the bushes behind us. And she lay down on the road. Broken tail and slant hair both came out of the bush and then started suckling from her. Of course, she hadn't had milk for well over a year. This was some sort of amazing bonding behaviour that no one had ever seen before. Extraordinary to see these 2 male tigers bigger than her suckling from her.
But I can't get through this day without actually mentioning a very great friend of mine. As I say, once you're doing this kind of work, you form these very, very close teams. And so I had my 2 great mates, Salim Ali and the other guy, Ajitya Singh. And Ajitya, I've known Ajitya for the last 25 years. We spent about 1,000 days working together. And my phone beeped at 6:30 this morning to say he was no more. He died last night. So he's been, I suppose, my best friend. One of, you have a few best friends in your life. He was certainly my best friend in India. So I might as well be open with you, but I've been struggling a little bit today. So, amazing guy. Great wildlife photographer. Look him up later if you get a chance to do just say. And we had worked together on some fairly standard BBC documentaries about a happy tiger family living in this place, and everything was wonderful. Aditya and I were very concerned in the late 90s about tigers in Rajasthan. And we followed one tiger for years, it disappeared, we made a film about it. And I think together we changed the way that tigers were conserved in Rajasthan, very much for the better. And the place where the tiger that followed for many years, where it died, Sonia Gandhi was president elect of India at the time. She got to see that film. She declared that area national park. There was another place we went on this journey, and that's been declared a national park as well. So it was the only film I really made in my life that I think made a fundamental difference. But anyway, yeah, I thought I couldn't go through the evening without mentioning old Jiggy, because he was one of a kind. And people just said to me, there's 1,000 people outside his house right now to see him. Not surprised. Anyway, so having spent many years with tigers, I came back to Ireland, and I heard RTE were looking for a wildlife series. And so I approached them and ended up spending the next 8 years making a series called Living the Wildlife. And that got me to every little corner of Ireland, every island, every boreen, every little valley. It was a wonderful way to see the country. And unfortunately, I got to see an awful lot of the negative things that was happening in the country. And I thought, in my naivety, that over the years, surely things were now going to get better, because so many of us knew that things were somehow going to get better. And I was quite surprised, maybe it was just my naivety again, that actually most things were actually still getting worse. But I got to see some fantastic things. I lived out in the Skelligs to film the skuas and the storm petrels at night, and on some of the offshore islands, some of my happiest memories, underwater with the whales and basking sharks and all sorts of things. But I started to look at the land and realised that there were so few places left where creatures could go. Many, many years ago, when I was about 22, I walked across the island of New Guinea. I spent 4 months walking and canoeing across New Guinea. And in those days, that was probably about the most pristine place left on earth. I remember being on the mountain there one day, and every place you could look, 100 miles into the distance, was just unbroken rainforest canopy, like a Garden of Eden. Most extraordinary place. And when I get back to Wicklow sometime later and sat on the hill, I had a very different impression. Every single square foot of land I could see was influenced either directly or indirectly by man. So against this background, COVID came, and we had kept an old, my mother said, we had a little country cottage back in the days when you could buy a country cottage in County Wicklow. It wasn't that big a deal. But my mother had cleverly kept an acre of land. When she sold that cottage after my dad died, we kept this acre of land. And I thought, I wonder what could I do with that acre? So I came from this traditional gardening background, as I say. But I thought every nature reserve, I wanted to create a nature reserve. And the secret to a nature reserve, every nature reserve in the world, are native plants. And so I thought, how would I go about that? So I started getting advice. I went into my patch that I hadn't seen for several years. The brambles were about 8 or 9 feet high. The brambles, fantastic plant. There were a few old apple trees, a few elders, a few hazels worth saving. What I didn't want to do was go and clear the entire site straight away. But I knew the basics of some of the things I had wanted. While I'd been making my Living the Wildlife series, I'd gone to several people's gardens, and they had really inspired me. One was a garden in County Wicklow, belonged to a guy called Angus Tyner, and he had built a pond, he said, in 4 hours 15 years ago. And he now had 15 species of dragonflies and damselflies, and I thought, that sounds amazing. And I went to his garden to see them. They're the most lovely creatures.
It's the damselflies that seem to be breeding right now. This female is alone, but most of the others are paired up and literally attached. Once mating has taken place, the male holds onto her and will not let her go until she has laid all her eggs. And the little aquatic larval stage will then grow and develop underwater for the next year or two, or even more in some species. So in fact, most of a dragonfly's life is actually spent underwater. But when conditions are right, they climb up and emerge in a piece of vegetation, shed their outer skin, and become the adult form that we recognize. It's just as well he's holding on to her nice and tight, because there's lots of other fellas around who'd like to trade places with him. And now that's a dragonfly laying its eggs. It's a chaser, and every time she dips in the water, she's depositing an egg. It's incredibly quick. What a sight. But you know, the secret of this place really is the foliage, the plants that have both been placed here and have developed naturally.
So this is one of the gardens I went to. It belongs to a guy called Angus Tyner, who lived near Ashford in County Wicklow. He had this incredible pond, several ponds, and he was saying, you know, it's amazing what happens when you just create a pond. And then it was surrounded by a wildflower meadow. Dragonflies and sandflies don't just need the pond itself, they need to be able to hunt other insects. So it's important that you don't just have the pond, but you have that wild area around it, which will supply an insect population. So when I was to build my garden, I was thinking back to Angus's. I'm going to have to make a pond. That's the first thing you're going to have to do. There's nothing more important you can do in a garden than introduce fresh water. It's the simplest thing to do. Any old water at all, standing in any way, you really can't go wrong. It attracts a huge amount of life. The other thing I wanted to do was to plant a native hedgerow all the way around the garden. I've been to Donegal. There's a really interesting guy up in Donegal called Stuart Dunlop. He had a great website, I think, which is now more called DonegalHedgerow.com. And he was a guy who used to go out walking his dog. He started bringing a camera and photographing all the different species he found in his hedge. And the day I met him, he had photographed 1,500 different species living in his local hedge.
What's that, Stuart? Almost looks like a flower, but it's not.
That's nice. That's a goal. Made by an insect, stimulating new growth in the rows. So there's a grub living in there. I actually haven't seen that one here before.
Is it the first?
It's the first for me, yep.
So does that mean it's 1,501?
1,501 species now, yeah. I'll get some shots of that.
Made by a fly or a wasp?
Yeah, a fire wasp. The female lays an egg on the leaf or the stem, stimulates new growth, makes a home for the grub, which lives inside the gall. There are thousands of different galls.
That's a particularly nice looking.
It's a pretty, yeah.
So now I have my pond. I planted my native hedge. I did things like hawthorn and whitethorn, guelder rose, alder buckthorn, hazel, spindle, oak, all these beautiful native plants which do not need any inputs. They just grow. You stick them in the ground and they grow. They never need to be watered. They don't need any insecticides or herbicides or fertilizers. They just grow. You stick them in the ground and they grow. And our insect life is adapted to feed on them, and often on them alone. So I knew I was going to have a pond and a hedgerow. Hedgerows attract a huge amount of life. And then there was the meadow. I went to another garden, a butterfly garden, in Maynooth, just outside Maynooth. And on the way there, I knew I was going to go and see this butterfly expert. I was keeping a lookout for butterflies. And I noticed I had not seen any at all. I got to his garden, and the entire place, it was about the size of this room, was fluttering. And I said to him, "What's your secret?" Native plants. The thing about so many insects, and butterflies illustrate this quite nicely, is that you can get butterflies into your buddleia bush or your exotic bush, and that's all fine. But they will only lay their eggs on very specific plants, and they are the native ones. I learned this lesson over the summer. I had a couple of big patches of nettles in my front field. And someone had said to me years ago, you should cut them in June, because when you stimulate the new growth, along will come the butterflies. And sure enough, I did. And within about 2 weeks, I had at least 1,000 caterpillars on those nettles. And they were the caterpillars of tortoiseshell butterflies, comets, red admirals, and peacocks. So 4 different butterflies in Ireland, our most colourful ones, only lay their eggs on nettles. So if you do not have nettles in your garden, and nettles in the sunshine, you won't have those butterflies. So the idea came to me in the garden. I wanted to, standing in the middle of that land, I wanted to think about, if a butterfly was flying over this place, how can I give it everything it needs to spend its life here with me? Or that or that dragonfly just spotted, trying to get inside its head. So instead of trying to create a sort of garden in an image I had in my head, I swapped it to thinking, what do the creatures need me to do for them to live here? And I know they certainly didn't want any insecticides, and all they needed was a variety of native plants. And the results have been staggering. I started 3 years ago now. Today, my hedgerow is flourishing, the wildflower meadow is flourishing, the ponds are flourishing. I've got frogs and newts and and lizards, and red squirrels and pine martens and badgers and all those things. I've got about 15 species of breeding butterflies, about the same of damselflies and dragonflies. It's all happened incredibly quickly. Now, the house where I live, I got a new partner about a year ago. She is more traditional garden, but she's in, as I say, she's transitioning. Now, I should explain that, because these days, it can be no, anyway, she's kind of going, she still loves her exotic flowers, but half her garden has now sort of gone wild, or turned into wildflowers and things of that nature. And I guess the conclusion I've come to, like I've got a lot of friends who love their gardens, but what I just try to encourage them now is by saying, well, if you don't use insecticides, and you don't use pesticides, and you don't use herbicides, and you don't import any soils and fertilizers, you're grand. Because one of the great problems, and it was quite, I just came back from France a couple of months ago, they banned them all over there. So you can't have any of those things in your gardens anymore. And guess what? French gardening has survived. It's thriving. The sides of the road look fantastic, because the councils don't use these sprays on the side of the road anymore. So you get all these vast amount of flowers every place. And hopefully that is the future for here too. Because the whole native gardening thing really is a no-brainer. When I sit out on my little porch now and look across this sort of, this landscape, I realise too, I'm looking across an Irish landscape. Because most gardens you go to have hardly an Irish plant in them. And we were sort of sold this idea that for a plant to be valuable, it had to come from someplace else. But it's funny, in New Zealand, like they're planting plants from Ireland, you get a nettle shoveled in a pot, send it over to New Zealand, someone will give you a tenner for it. And it's, you know, unless it comes in a pot and you have to spend cash, it seems as if the plant has no value. But of course, our native ones, we've been turned against them. I sometimes think in ways, perhaps, our entire way of looking at the land and our relationship with nature was effectively colonized out of us. We have a very British way of looking at the land, in fact. We treat the land in a very British way. And as much as I love England, and I have an awful lot to be grateful to England for, and I was educated there, and in fact I love the place, they're not great land managers. Not when it comes to nature, that's for sure. But we had, in the time, we had our old Breton laws where every tree in Ireland was protected by law once upon a time, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And nowadays that all seems to have fallen by the wayside. But I do think, and one thing that really has struck me, is that because Ireland is a semi-natural sort of landscape, it's been so heavily influenced by man, that is a bit of an advantage, because so many of the habitats we see now were so influenced by man that we can influence them, to come back in the future. I mean, I've now created a meadow around my garden, and it's you know, got all the standard old meadow plants that we used to have once upon a time, the yellow rattle and the cowslips and all these sorts of things that were such a feature of every field. I mean, I remember growing up in Dublin. My uncle had a house in a place called Stillorgan, about 3 miles from Dublin city centre, and there were 4 calling male cornfields there in those days. They have since disappeared across the country. The Common Agricultural Policy came in. I never go about blaming farmers for anything. Farmers did what they were asked to do. They did what they were asked to do. They did it incredibly well. But I think in the future what we're going to have to do is ask them to do something else. People say they're very conservative lot, and I say no, not really, because when you think how they used to farm, they actually change their farming methods very quickly if that's the way the market goes. So they're very capable of changing, and it looks like the way things are happening now that, you know, things are moving in that direction. But of course, no one likes when change happens. It can be costly in the short term. So if you ask people, do you want to protect nature? Do you want birds? Do you want butterflies? Everyone tends to go, yeah. But now this is what you're going to have to do to have all these things. Then people tend to hesitate. But I do really, I get a sense that Ireland's at a bit of a turning point. And as I say, so many of these habitats can be rebuilt. You know, I go to countries around the world where they're stuffed. You know, a place like Borneo that I went to 30 years ago, you know, just coast to coast, just wonderful big trees. Now you can drive for a day in Borneo and not see a tree. So you'd have a complete change of landscape that's never coming back in sort of human lifetime. But we have and I really see it as a golden opportunity in Ireland now to really rebuild this country. We talk about infrastructure all the time. Well, I've got a new word, biostructure, a living structure for the landscape. I met the man who was often, it's funny how people have problems with words. Biodiversity is a word that a lot of people have problems with. And I met the man who's supposedly coined it, a guy called E.O. Wilson, who's a fantastic zoologist. I was lucky enough to have dinner with him a few years ago. He's passed on now. But for some reason, people have struggled with that word biodiversity, just the diversity of life, the amount of different living things that can live in a place, plant or animal. But this idea of a biostructure, that every landscape, we don't just think of it in terms of roads and railways and bridges, but we think, how can we create a living landscape that runs alongside that one? I get tired of people saying, you're trying to stop things. No, you're trying to do things in a different way that you're doing them now. I see it as a great challenge to be able to find the sweet spot between giving us all a comfortable lifestyle, between giving us a landscape that is working for us. But I think there is room there for everything. And the more I see it, you see fields all around here, all over the country, where rubbish hedgerows. Well, if they were great hedgerows, maybe you could get 1,500 species in those too. You get a lot of these things which are torn to shreds around here. Well, I don't know who's in charge of it, but I mean, I've just seen so many miles of hedgerows utterly destroyed around here. And you phone the council, sometimes out of time with all they're doing it when they should be doing this as well. And that's just depressing and doesn't have to happen. I mean, any farmer worth his salt, or any man who keeps stock, man or woman who keeps stock, should know that when these big storms come in off the west coast, the cattle and the sheep will be sitting up against the hedge if they possibly can be. Cattle are forest animals. I was with a group of farmers recently who didn't believe me, but there you go. They evolved in forests, and so they love to be in that landscape. They can have that protection. A happy cow, I guess, is a happy cow, is a healthy cow, is a heavy cow, is a profitable cow. So I think working with the landscape, now we can't change everything overnight, absolutely not. But I see no reason why things cannot get better and better. My garden has inspired me, I guess, to think about that as well. I have seen how quickly a piece of land that had extremely little is now so full of life. I was sitting out on my porch there the other day, being barked at by red squirrels. A pine marten came around the corner. He was surprised to see me. He went away. And then the pine martens made me think, I'm just going to go on to a little story. The return of the pine marten has been a great thing to Ireland. And I just want to show you these little things. The pine marten is one of those stories which gives me hope. When I was a kid, we had a little book called The Observer's Book of Wildlife. I won't remember them at the time. All we had were these little books, and it was British wildlife, because we didn't have our own books, really, natural history books at that time. The pine marten was incredibly elusive in those days in Ireland, a tiny population there. And then once we stopped persecuting them and poisoning them, their populations absolutely rebounded, and they're now found all over the place. We're tripping over them. And they've had a fundamental effect on the countryside. The place where I now live in Wicklow, I saw my first grey squirrel there in 1974 and was incredibly excited to see a new kind of animal, one I'd never seen before. Grey squirrel came in from North America. Over the next few years, we started to see grey squirrels every place, and the red started disappearing. For about 15 years, a red squirrel was not seen in that woodland. Now, the pine martens got there about 5 years ago, spreading into that part of the world. I can't find a grey, and the place is absolutely full of reds. So this sort of old, this animal which disappeared, which had been such a fundamental part of our landscape, now that it has returned, it sort of alters the balance of power once more. And it's a real lesson that if you bring something back, it can have a sort of a cascade effect. Most wonderful animals. But this is a little scene I filmed the other day, or the other year, for the series called Living the Wildlife, and it just shows how sometimes wildlife presenters can make right Egypts of themselves.
I reckon they're still up in the attic. You see, she can bring them food, So they don't really have to come out if they're still small, so. But I'm not going to see them on a day like this. There's no point in me hanging around here because they won't come out. And there's so many animals, not just pine martens, but rabbits and badgers and foxes and all those things. They just do more during the fine weather. They hate the rain. What? I just said they came onto the table. Could be 2, could be 3, I don't know, I can't tell. Can't resist that food. Maybe they're coming at night, they're just so confident. This is unbelievable. Who was I complaining about the weather? Saying what a miserable day it was and how wild animals hate these sorts of conditions. I've never been so glad to be completely wrong.
That was a nice little scene we filmed in Galway, I think it was, then just at the back of Leanne there. But yeah, so the pine martens have become incredibly common these days. Sorry, that was just slightly out of sync there. This is what my garden looked like in the first year. Now, as you notice, there are some exotics up there for the keen observers. Oh. There was Phacelia and things of that nature up around the house. And the reason for that was that the BBC wanted to see some colour the first year. They felt that their audience wanted to see some colour. So that has all now disappeared, and everything you see in the foreground there is native. And so in the pond, I've got my 2 native lilies and frogbit and iris and all sorts of water avens and all those sorts of marginal plants. And the pond requires no work. I've just put in the plants and left it. And the meadow that's now around it, I have to cut once a year around this time of year. So for any of you who are fed up cutting the lawn, I recommend that. The hedgerow, I haven't had to do anything with that. I reckon I can manage this acre of land with about 2 days' work a year. Now, as a result, it all just grows into each other. Initially, you find, for any gardeners amongst you, things like bindweed and things of nature, initially you see it all over the place and you get a fright and you think, what do I do? Do I have to get rid of that? I have found that the more competition you introduce into the garden, plants just sort themselves out. Nothing has died in my garden yet. I haven't watered them. I've just chucked in the seed, and there's something about planting seed that if the seed decides to grow, that plant has already made a decision that this is the right place, it's the right aspect, the right soil type. And so the place is thriving. That's what people tend to say, that when they come to the garden, that every plant looks healthy. If you go out to your woodland, every plant looks healthy. You go to the bog, every plant looks healthy. Why is that? Because the native plants adapted to live in this climate. The pond has changed. That was the first year. That was when it was about 3 months old. Things like poppies around to give a little bit of colour, the odd cornflower or something. Now the meadow has matured a lot. They say it's full of newts, it's full of frogs, dragonflies, damselflies. And I've spent enough time looking at that pond to know that if I am reincarnated, I do not want to be reincarnated as a pond creature. Because it's the Serengeti out there. You know, I sit in my little rocking chair on my porch looking across this lovely serene scene. And I think about it, yeah, from my point of view it's serene. But if I'm living out there, there's nothing serene about life out there. It's vicious. Like my pond is like the Serengeti. Everything in there is hunting and eating everything else. Like nature is often pretty unpleasant. I had thousands of tadpoles in the pond this year. And I'd say maybe a couple of dozen made it out. Because there were so many things. The dragonflies and the damselflies that look so beautiful flying about the place, they are voracious predators. Remember when I was a kid, we were sent out in school to go find a pond and go pond dipping and bring in as many aquatic creatures as we could. And I was delighted. I found about maybe 20 different kinds of things. I had them all in a jam jar. left them down in the back room out in the scullery, came down in the morning, and I had one creature in a jam jar. It was a dragonfly, and it had eaten everything else. So the competition in the pond is fierce, and when you hear the birds singing, of course, they're all telling each other to get lost. It's actually low intensity sort of warfare out there. But we're very lucky that so many of these things sound nice to the human ear. I always think it'd be tragic if it didn't. Yeah, so having all those creatures around me, with the state of the world over the years, it used to get me down. I used to get quite depressed about it, really. And then I decided one day, you get to a certain age, really, I'm actually not going to be depressed anymore. I've only got so many years on this earth, and I'm actually going to enjoy them. And but this garden, developing this garden, gave me a real sense of purpose, of being able to do something really positive. Sometimes I think one can feel overwhelmed by, the scale of the problems in the world. And they are massive. They are massive. But we're incredibly lucky to live where we live. We're buffered from so many of them. We live in a temperate climate. We've got a relatively small population. And we're in a very fortunate position of being able to make choices about what we do with our land. Most peoples in the world don't have that choice anymore. The choice is long gone, but we actually have that choice. So for that reason, I think it's a very exciting time. But there is a great resistance to change, isn't there? There's a great resistance. I mean, I've seen in Westport just a little, but the river was coming back beautifully. And I fully understand that people are used to, it used to be the landlord, whoever it was who designed the river, wanted it a particular way, and a lot of people here still want it that way, but that's a sterile way, a way where nature doesn't exist. The place I'm actually doing the North Sea radio program about the river at the moment, because it is encapsulated everything, encapsulated so many of the problems, that people know that it's important to restore nature. It's important to get your rivers back and your hedgerows back. But then when you try and do it, the surprising amount of resistance there is, and what vocal resistance, often the opposition to these ideas, those voices tend to be a lot stronger than the people who are actually trying to protect it, it seems. So I was out walking along the riverbank, and I was seeing all these beautiful banded damselflies, and otters coming off the little gravel islands at night. Dippers were nesting there, moorhens moved back into the mall for the first time, just a place for them to walk. But a lot of people wanted it shifted and cleaned and scarified and remove all the native plants from the walls and replace them with colourful exotic things along, which is, I used to get, I no longer get. I go down there now, and what I see, personally, is a sterile mess. But what other people see is this really neat river the way it always used to be. So it takes time to get your head, and I guess when I find myself in my garden, I want everything to go wild, but I suddenly find myself doing things in sort of straight lines, because we're sort of hardwired to do that. And in some countries around the world, my God, around your house you want to clear it completely, because there's dangerous animals, there's snakes, there's all sorts of things. But in this country, we don't have that problem. I've noticed too that when children come, we're always thinking about children, what are the children going to do? They go out into your normal garden, there's really not much to do in terms of interacting with the natural world. It's grass and maybe a gristle in your hedge, there's nothing to see there. When I bring kids to my garden, there's an app that you can get on your phone now called the Seek app. And although I don't generally like to see kids with phones, this Seek app is fantastic. Because when you hold it over a plant, or an insect, or a butterfly, it tells you what it is. Now, a lot of people get pretty snobby about these things. Oh, well, you should really look it up in a book. And I say, no, absolutely not. If the phone can give you that information, and it's a technology people like to use, why not use it? I use it all the time. I'm learning things like hoverflies at the moment. I'm upgrading hoverflies. So besides the butterflies and the moths and the sawflies and the hoverflies, there are lots of different kinds of pollinators. We always hear about bees, and of course bees are incredibly important, but all these other things are too. One little interesting thing I learned, we were chatting about bees earlier. I was going to put up a log hive in my garden. I thought, well, I get a natural log hive and stick it up in the tree. And all my solitary bee friends, we've got 100 species of bees in Ireland, and about 80 of them are solitary bees. There's only one kind of honeybee, only one bee makes honey. Then we've got bumblebees and things of that nature, and then we've got solitary bees. bees, bees that either live underground or live in cavities or wood and things like that. And they are the rare bees in Ireland. Honeybees are not the rare bees. Honeybees are now domesticated animals, like cattle, sheep, things like that. But I thought, will I put one up in my garden? And all my solitary bee friends said, absolutely not. And I said, why not? He said, because you will be releasing 50,000 hungry mouths into your garden, and they will outcompete the solitary bees. So please don't. So I didn't. But then my neighbour got bees. And of course, bees don't know boundaries. So now I say I'm going to charge him for all the honey he's making out of my garden. But so yeah, I've learned a lot over the years, and I'm still learning. And there's been no sort of guide for that. I'm trying to write a book at the moment, but my lord, it's difficult, isn't it? Just to sit down and get all the thoughts out on paper. But I do feel that native gardening has a real future. Because for people who are attracted to gardening, they're attracted really to the feeling, I think, of vitality and life around them. And I realised so many things I used to do as a kid, I never thought about how damaging they were. You know, I used to love butterflies, but I'd weed kill the nettles. And like in my garden now, I just think about food plants, so nettles for those ones. Then I want orange-tipped butterflies to breed, so I've got to make sure that I've got lady smock, the flower lady smock, because that's the only place that they lay their eggs. And then I see something like a silver wash fritillary come in. I know they need dog violets. I've got to make sure I've got dog violets. And then I see, so every butterfly I see in the area, I think, what do they need? What food plant do they need? And as soon as the plants are there, the creatures will come. And it happens remarkably quickly. So if any of you have a patch of your garden, I urge you to try it and to see how interesting. You know, someone used to say to me, well, what does your garden look like in winter? And I say, well, it looks like winter. And I think your garden, when you look out, you can look out. I remember when I was growing up, we looked out into our garden, there was a patch of grass and a bristling hedge. It looked the same really on the 1st of June and the 1st of December. There's no great seasonal difference, an evergreen hedge and sort of an evergreen lawn. But now, when I wander around my place, I can pretty much tell, not just what time, but almost what week of the year it is, about what's in flower, what insects I'm seeing, and things of that nature. So it's a totally different way of looking at gardening. It's giving the natural world a chance. And I think it's something that anyone happens to have a piece of land. It's something you can do. Don't worry about making mistakes. There's no absolutes. It's just the general idea. Get your native hedging in, it'll thrive, and the creatures will turn up, and it just makes me very happy. I get a real sense of contentment when I sit out in the little balcony of my cabin now. And you know, when you've had a bit of a bad day or something, then instead of come back and head into the fridge for a glass of wine, I go now and sit in my rocking chair and look out all my garden and think, I'm giving all these little creatures out here a place to live. It makes me feel good, and hopefully make you feel good too. Thanks. Or anything like that they would like to shout out, I'd be more than happy to.
It's gone, and now the red ones are back.
Oh, how come the grey? Yeah. How come the grey squirrels? Well, grey squirrels are from North America. Some Egypt brought them into Northern Ireland about 100 years ago. Pine martens and red squirrels evolved together on this island. The red squirrel is a native squirrel to this island. So because they both evolved together, it means that the red squirrel has behavioural strategies to avoid being predated by pine martens. Now, its American cousin has never met a pine marten, doesn't know what to do. So it's not though a question, I don't think it's as simple as pine martens go around killing all the greys. My guess is that the female greys have stopped breeding in places. I think they're disappearing too quickly. I don't think they're all being, pine martens spend most of their lives eating berries and little things and nuts and things like that, small things. But they're opportunist predators. But yeah, so the reason is so they can get the greys, they will get reds occasionally, but rarely, because the reds know how to deal with it. Exotic speak is imperfect, but it's the one time when Roundup might work, used very selectively by someone who knows what they're doing, I would say. I mean, so all these things used in the right way, at the right time, the right quantities, can be incredibly useful. I mean, all amazing inventions to be able to use these things in certain situations. But it's just that we've gotten so used to just throwing them around that doesn't make any sense. I mean, Wiltshire years ago.
That was kind of what my thinking was. And the other thing is your garden looks absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, well, now to a lot of people, it can look a bit of a mess. I must tell you a story. John Murray, who owns a production company now based in Westport, runs a company called Crossing the Line Films. He made this film with me. And at the end of the project, his mother's quite a keen gardener, elderly woman. She said, could she come down and see my garden? And I wasn't there that day. And I phoned her up that evening and said, oh, hi, did you get down to the garden? She said, I did. She said, it was all a bit of a mystery. She said, I found your cabin, but I couldn't find your garden. So, you see, I've essentially created a little bit of rural Ireland. But you see, I see this, it's always lovely, surrounded by all the trees. No, I see this in Dublin form. You see, I see this as a fundamental, we've gotten used to, you know, sterile gardens with flat grass and exotic hedges where no life, like that's weird. So people call me weird for wanting Irish plants back in Ireland and all the creatures that come with them. No, it's a potential to flip all these things back and to see kids out, as I see in my garden, getting really excited, catching frogs, catching butterflies, photographing them with the sea gap, engaging in the garden once more. That's a really exciting thing. And so many of us came from, you know, childhoods maybe where we had a lot more freedom than kids have now. And we know what it's like to collect frog spawn, and we know what it's like to collect all these things. But there's a generation growing up now who really know almost nothing about it. And so that's, I mean, we've done so much damage. Our generation, the luckiest generation that have ever lived in the history of the world, is us. We hit the sweet spot. I'm always thinking about it. We haven't had to go to war. We live in effectively an incredibly peaceful world. We could travel the world in safety. No generation before us or after us is going to be as lucky as we are. Of that I'm convinced. Because people might have other advantages into the future, or offspring might, but the world has changed beyond all recognition. And it's a shadow of what it was when I first saw it, when I started traveling 40, 50 years ago. So you might have the lifestyle, you might be able to afford your cappuccinos, but you won't be able to see half the things that used to live in the world once upon a time. So I think we're just incredibly lucky to have lived at this particular time. Incredibly.